On a green mound at the edge of the Baltic, on a quiet spit of land in the Polish city of Gdańsk, there is a tall gray monument you can see from the water long before you reach it. Families walk their dogs beneath it. Ferries slide past on their way out to sea, and gulls turn in the wind over the pines. It is a peaceful place now, and there is almost nothing left to tell you what happened here. But at 48 minutes past 4 in the morning, on the 1st of September 1939, the guns of an old German battleship, anchored a stone's throw from this shore, opened fire on the men sleeping on this peninsula. Those shells are remembered by much of the world as the first shots of the Second World War. The soldiers defending this place numbered around 200. They had been told to hold for 12 hours. They held for 7 days. This is the entire story of Westerplatte. For most of the war that followed, and for decades after it ended, Westerplatte was the purest symbol Poland possessed. A tiny garrison, hopelessly outnumbered, that simply refused to fall. The story was told and retold until it hardened into legend, a handful of men who fought to the last bullet and the last breath, and died where they stood. It is one of the most inspiring stories of the entire war. It is also not quite true. And here is the strange part. The truth is not smaller than the legend. It is larger and harder and far more human. The men who defended Westerplatte were braver than the myth made them, not less. And the ones who survived carried a piece of that truth in silence for 50 years. If this is your first time here, we tell the stories of the places the war turned into battlegrounds and the people caught inside them. If that is what you came for, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you would think. To understand why the Second World War began on this particular scrap of sand, you have to understand the strange, doomed little country that surrounded it. When the First World War ended and the map of Europe was redrawn, the victorious Allies faced a problem. Poland had been reborn after more than a century of erasure, and a reborn Poland needed access to the sea. The trouble was that the natural port for that access, the great Baltic city of Danzig, was overwhelmingly German. So the peacemakers invented a compromise that satisfied no one. Danzig was made a free city, not part of Germany, not part of Poland, but a self-governing statelet under the protection of the League of Nations, wrapped inside a strip of Polish territory that became known as the Polish Corridor. It was a German city in all but name, surrounded by a Poland it resented, and by the 1930s it was seething with Nazi sympathy. Into that tense arrangement, the League handed Poland one small consolation. On the Westerplatte Peninsula, a low wooded finger of land at the mouth of the harbor, Poland was permitted to build a military transit depot, a place to unload and store weapons and ammunition shipped in by sea, safely apart from the German population of the city. It was granted in 1924, and it came with strict conditions. Poland could keep no more than 88 soldiers there, and Poland was forbidden to fortify it. For years, Poland quietly ignored both rules. Watching the free city drift deeper into Hitler's orbit, Polish officers understood exactly what Westerplatte would become if war came, and they prepared for it in secret. They raised the size of the garrison in careful stages, slipping extra men in and out disguised as civilians so the count would never look wrong. The final buildup came in the spring of 1939. That March, Hitler bullied neighboring Lithuania into surrendering a stretch of the Baltic coast, and it became obvious to everyone watching that Danzig would be next. Through the tense summer that followed, the little garrison quietly armed itself for a fight it was not supposed to be able to make. Into the depot came Mauser rifles, around 40 machine guns, a pair of small anti-tank guns, 4 mortars, and a single elderly field cannon. It was almost nothing against a modern army, but it was enough to make the peninsula bite, and they built. Behind the walls of the innocent-looking depot, they constructed 5 reinforced concrete guardhouses, squat and low and easy to miss, with hidden firing positions cut into their walls and their cellars turned into strong points. They wove a ring of field outposts through the trees and gave them ordinary names: the ferry, the fort, the baths, the power station. On paper, Westerplatte was a customs post with a token guard. In reality, it had become a small camouflaged fortress, and the men inside it knew the day was coming when they would have to prove it. They could feel the noose tightening through 1939. Across the water, the Free City was openly Nazi now, its swastika flags hanging from the old Hanseatic gables, its radio pouring out the same message coming from Berlin, that Danzig was German, that the Polish corridor was an insult, that it would all be corrected soon. The garrison on the peninsula was a Polish island in a German sea, a few hundred meters of pine and sand, surrounded by a population that wanted them gone, and beyond that, a country that intended to take them by force. They did not need a warning to know what was coming. They only had to look out across the harbor at the city that hated them and wait. The instrument the Germans chose to open the war was almost a museum piece. The Schleswig-Holstein was a pre-dreadnought battleship launched back in 1906, obsolete long before 1939, kept around mostly as a training ship for cadets. But she carried heavy guns, great 11-inch weapons that could throw a shell the weight of a man, and for what the Germans had in mind, she was perfect. In the last week of August 1939, the Schleswig-Holstein sailed into Danzig on what was announced as a courtesy visit, a friendly call to honor the war dead of an earlier conflict. The people of the Free City lined the quays to welcome her. She had arrived on the 25th of August, and the attack very nearly came days earlier than it did. The Marines were once already at their stations, ready to go ashore on the 26th, when the order was suddenly cancelled. Britain had just signed a mutual defense pact with Poland, Hitler flinched, and the assault was postponed. The reprieve lasted less than a week. The battleship dropped anchor in the harbor channel, and then, quietly, she shifted her position until her guns pointed directly at the Polish depot, barely 150 meters across the water. On board, unseen, was a company of German Marines, more than 200 of them, ready to storm the peninsula the moment the guns fell silent. The whole plan rested on speed. The garrison was expected to fold within 12 hours, long before help could reach it from the Polish mainland, and a battleship firing at point-blank range was meant to guarantee it. The Polish commander, a career officer named Major Henryk Sucharski, watched the old battleship settle into her firing position and understood what it meant. His garrison went on to its highest alert. And in the black early hours of the 1st of September, the waiting ended. At 48 minutes past 4, the Schleswig-Holstein opened fire at point-blank range, and the shells came screaming into Westerplatte. The war had begun. A few minutes earlier and far to the south, German bombers had begun destroying the Polish town of Wielun, and so the honor of the very first shot is sometimes argued over by historians, but it was Westerplatte and the old guns of the Schleswig-Holstein that the world fixed on as the place where the Second World War started. Sucharski's radio operator tapped out a desperate signal to the Polish naval base across the bay. Under fire, this is not a drill. It is one of the small ironies of that morning that the battleship's opening salvo did almost no harm. Fired from so close, the heavy shells did not travel far enough to arm themselves properly, and many of them punched into the sand and the trees without exploding. The bombardment that was meant to shatter the garrison in minutes killed no one. And 8 minutes later, when the German Marines rose up and advanced onto the peninsula, expecting to walk across a corpse-strewn ruin, the men of Westerplatte were still very much alive and waiting for them. What happened next was the thing no one on the German side had planned for. The Marines came on confidently, certain the naval guns had done their work, and they walked straight into a wall of fire. From the hidden slits of the guardhouses and the camouflaged outposts in the trees, positions the men had given plain, almost homely names like the Fort, the Ferry, and the Baths. Polish machine guns opened up on them at close range. The single Polish field gun, a small 75mm piece, fired more than 24 shells across the water into the German positions before it was finally knocked out, and Polish anti-tank guns raked the advancing infantry. The Marines, caught in the open on ground they had been told was already won, broke and fell back. The officer leading them, Lieutenant Henningsen, who had brought his men off the battleship expecting a morning's work, was cut down and mortally wounded in the fighting. They tried again and were thrown back again, and a third time and a third time thrown back. By the end of that first day, the elite German shock company that was supposed to seize Westerplatte in a couple of hours had been bloodied and stopped cold, and the little peninsula that should have fallen before breakfast was still flying the Polish flag. Somewhere in the German command, there was a dawning, uncomfortable realization. They did not know what they were fighting. They could not see the Polish positions clearly. They could not tell how many men were in there, and every time they came forward, they lost more of their own. The garrison that was supposed to be a formality had turned into a problem, and the Germans began to reach for heavier and heavier tools to solve it. When the ground assaults failed, they turned to the sky. On the second day of the battle, the Luftwaffe was called in, and dozens of Junkers Stuka dive bombers came howling down over the peninsula. Close to 50 of them took part, dropping tons of bombs onto a target only a few hundred meters wide. The Stuka was one of the terror weapons of the early war, a machine fitted with sirens that screamed as it fell, so that the sound alone was designed to break the nerve of the men beneath it, and it dropped its bombs with a precision that ordinary artillery could not match. Wave after wave came down on Westerplatte, and this time the destruction was real, and in the middle of that raid, a single bomb found the one target that mattered most. It struck guardhouse number 5 directly, and the reinforced concrete that had protected the men inside from shells and bullets was no defense against a bomb falling out of the sky. The guardhouse was destroyed, and the soldiers sheltering within it were killed, buried under the wreckage of the strong point that was supposed to keep them alive. 7 men died there in a single instant. For the defenders, it was a catastrophe, not only for the men it killed, but for what it did to those who survived. Until that moment, the garrison had been winning an impossible fight, throwing back everything the Germans sent. Now, for the first time, they had felt the full weight of what was coming for them, and they understood that no amount of courage was going to stop the bombs. It was the moment the defense of Westerplatte came closest to breaking, and it broke, for a time, at the very top. Here is the detail that changes how you hear the rest of this story. The heroic legend of Westerplatte has always been built around its commander, Major Sucharski, the steady hand who held his men together for 7 days against the odds. The reality, hidden for half a century, was different. When guardhouse number 5 was destroyed and the scale of the horror became clear, Major Sucharski appears to have come apart. By most accounts, he suffered something like a breakdown under the strain. Some say a seizure, some say a collapse of nerve, the kind of thing that can happen to any human being when the world is exploding around him, and the men he is responsible for are dying. He ordered the garrison's secret codes burned, a thing you do only when you believe the end has come. And he wanted to surrender. He may even have had a white flag briefly raised. Part of what makes this so hard to judge, even now, is that no one is entirely certain what orders the garrison actually carried. Some evidence suggests they were told to fight to the finish. Other evidence suggests they were only ever meant to hold for a set number of hours as a delaying action, buying time for the army on the mainland. That uncertainty sits underneath everything Sucharski did in those hours. If the job was to hold for 12 hours, then by the second day the job was already done, and every further death was arguably for nothing. Into that vacuum stepped his deputy, a captain named Franciszek Dabrowski, and it was Dabrowski, as much as anyone, who kept Westerplatte fighting. He argued against surrender. He took effective command of the defense while his commander struggled, and he held the garrison to its task through the hardest days that followed. None of this was known to the Polish public for 50 years. After the war, the surviving officers made a quiet pact among themselves. Out of respect for Sucharski and for the honor of the unit, they agreed that as long as any of them lived, they would not reveal that their nominal commander had been shell-shocked for much of the battle. They kept that promise. It was only in the 1990s, after the men who had made the vow were gone, that the fuller, more complicated truth came out. And it does not diminish them. A man who breaks under bombardment and a man who steadies the line in his place are both telling you the same thing, that this was not a legend of supermen, but a story of ordinary, frightened human beings doing extraordinary things at the edge of what a person can endure. If this story is landing the way it landed on us while we researched it, take a moment to subscribe. We go deep on places like this every single video, and the next ones are already coming. The defense went on, and it went on the way sieges do, not in glory, but in exhaustion. Cut off on their peninsula, the men of Westerplatte settled into a grinding routine of bombardment and probe and counterattack, day after day, with no sleep and dwindling everything. The old battleship pounded them from the water. German artillery hammered the tree line. And still, whenever the infantry came forward, the hidden guardhouses drove them back, so that the Germans could never quite tell how many defenders remained or where they were. But the garrison was being ground down all the same. Food ran short. Water ran short. Ammunition had to be counted. Worst of all was the state of the wounded. The garrison had one doctor, Captain Mieczysław Slaby, working with almost nothing, and in the damp cellars the wounds began to turn. Gangrene set in among men who could not be evacuated and could not be properly treated, and there was nothing to be done for them but watch them suffer. Slaby would be remembered afterward for the way he kept those men alive with next to no supplies, and for staying with the wounded to the very end and into captivity. The Germans tried new cruelties to force the issue. They rolled burning rail cars soaked in fuel toward the depot, hoping to set the whole peninsula alight and smoke the defenders out. On the third day, word reached the garrison that Britain and France had finally declared war on Germany, and for a moment there was hope. The news ran through the exhausted men like a current. Somewhere out there, the great powers were entering the war on Poland's side, and surely now they would not be left alone. But the help never came. No relief force fought its way to the coast. No Allied fleet appeared in the bay. The truth was that Poland was being overrun everywhere at once, the whole front folding inward faster than anyone had imagined, and the 12 hours the garrison had been asked to hold had long since stretched into a second day, and a third, and a fourth, with no one coming for them. They were holding a position that no longer had any strategic purpose in a war that was already being lost around them, for the simple reason that they had been told to hold, and they would not be the ones to stop. There is a hard truth buried in that. In cold military terms, the defense of Westerplatte changed almost nothing. The peninsula was a tiny outpost with no power to alter the invasion. The relief was never truly coming, and whether the garrison fell in 12 hours or 7 days made no real difference to the campaign that was swallowing Poland whole. But wars are not fought only in cold military terms. What Westerplatte bought was not time. It was proof that the German war machine was not invincible, that Polish soldiers would stand and fight and make the invader bleed for every meter. And in the darkest weeks of the collapse, that proof was worth more to a broken nation than any patch of ground. And it is worth remembering who these men actually were. They were not a corps of hardened commandos. They were ordinary Polish soldiers and reservists, many of them young, some of them there on routine duty when the world caught fire around them. They had trained in secret for a fight like this, but nothing trains a person for a week under naval guns and dive bombers with no sleep, no relief, and friends dying in the next room. They held anyway. Not because they were fearless, but because each of them had quietly decided that he would not be the first to break. On the morning of the 7th of September, it ended. Before dawn, the Germans opened up with everything they had, the heaviest bombardment of the whole battle, and it went on for hours. The Schleswig-Holstein joined in from the water, so that the peninsula was raked from the sea and the land at once. German assault troops brought flamethrowers up against the guardhouses, and fire washed over the concrete strongpoints that had held for a week. One guardhouse was destroyed outright, and others were left cracked and burning, and inside them the defenders had reached the end of what flesh and will could do. They had no relief, no supplies worth the name, wounded men rotting in the cellars, and no reason left to believe that another day of dying would change anything at all. At a final conference of his officers, Major Sucharski made the decision to surrender, and this time it held. At 9:45 in the morning, a white flag went up over Westerplatte. After 7 days, the guns fell silent. What happened at the surrender has stayed with people ever since, because it was not what you would expect from the army that had just spent a week being humiliated by 200 men. The Germans were impressed. They had expected a walkover, and instead had been held for a week by a garrison a fraction of their size, and when the Polish defenders finally marched out, their captors treated them not as a beaten rabble, but as soldiers who had earned respect. The German commander who accepted the surrender allowed Major Sucharski to keep the ceremonial saber at his side as he went into captivity, a gesture of honor from one officer to another, extraordinary in the opening days of a war that would soon abandon every such courtesy. Accounts describe German soldiers standing at attention as the defenders came out, presenting arms to an enemy who had cost them a week and their pride. For a few minutes on that peninsula, before the machinery of occupation and atrocity descended on Poland, two groups of soldiers acknowledged each other simply as soldiers. The men who had defended Westerplatte, filthy, exhausted, and grieving their dead, then walked into 5.5 years of imprisonment scattered across the prison camps of the Reich, and not all of them would live to come home. But they walked off that peninsula with something the German army had not managed to take from them. Now, the myth begins, and it is worth separating it carefully from the men because they deserve the truth more than they deserve the legend. In the days after the battle, as German armies rolled across Poland and disaster followed disaster, Polish radio seized on Westerplatte as a rare point of light. Again and again, the broadcasters repeated a single phrase, "Westerplatte is still fighting," until the little garrison became a national rallying cry, proof that Poland had not simply crumbled. People began to call it a Polish Thermopylae, after the ancient stand of a doomed few against a vast army, the small sacrifice that shames the larger defeat around it. A famous poet wrote a poem imagining the fallen defenders marching up into heaven, and in the telling, a powerful and enduring image took hold. The defenders of Westerplatte had died to the last man, fighting to the end, giving their lives for their country. It was magnificent. It was also false. The garrison did not die to the last man. Of the roughly 200 who defended the peninsula, only about 15 were killed. The overwhelming majority survived the battle and went into captivity, and many of them lived long lives and came home to a Poland that had been told they were all dead heroes. The reality of their survival does not cheapen what they did. If anything, it sharpens it. These were men who fought as hard as any who died, who endured a week of bombardment and dive bombers and flamethrowers, and who then had to go on living in the shadow of a legend that had quietly written most of them out of their own story. Their commander, Major Sucharski, survived the war only to die in 1946, honored as a hero and promoted to general, the full truth of his breakdown still buried. In 1971, long after his death, his ashes were carried back to the peninsula and laid to rest at Westerplatte itself, beneath the great monument the communist government had razed to the battle and bent to its own purposes, turning a story of Polish soldiers into a parable of the state. It would be decades before Poland was ready to know that its perfect symbol had been made of ordinary breakable people, and longer still before it understood that this made the story better, not worse. Not far away, on that same first morning of the war, another group of Poles had defended the Polish post office in Danzig against a similar assault. They were postal workers and reservists, not frontline soldiers, men who picked up rifles to defend their own building. They held for hours, and then they surrendered, and the Germans did not treat them as prisoners of war. They treated them as criminals and shot them. That was the war that was coming. Measured against it, the courtesy shown to the men of Westerplatte was a last flicker of an older code that the next 6 years would extinguish almost everywhere. The old battleship that fired the first shots did not long outlive the war she had started. She was bombed and sunk in the Baltic in the final year of the fighting, an obsolete relic that had opened the deadliest conflict in human history and then slipped quietly beneath the same gray sea. But the symbol she had tried to destroy only grew. Through the German occupation, Polish resistance fighters named their strongpoints after Westerplatte. And decades later, when the shipyard workers of this very city rose up against communist rule and began the movement that would help bring down the entire Soviet bloc, they did it in the shadow of the same legend, the idea, born on this peninsula, that a few determined people who refused to yield could matter more than all the force arrayed against them. Today, Westerplatte is quiet again. The great gray monument to the coast defenders rises on its mound above the peninsula, and each year on the 1st of September, the country gathers there in the pale morning light to remember what began on this ground. One of the old guardhouses still stands, preserved as a museum, its concrete scarred and pitted, so that visitors can put their hands on the walls the defenders fired from. Down among the pines, the broken shapes of the other strong points still lie half sunk in the earth, marked by the fire of that week, slowly being reclaimed by grass and root. And on the 1st of September each year, before the sun is fully up, presidents and school children and old men gather on the mound in the cold morning air, at the same hour the guns first spoke, and stand in silence. It is Subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. We have more places like Westerplatte coming, and every one of them has a story the rest of the internet forgot.